Welcome back, everyone, to Lost Shrine. Tonight I'm bringing you 10 true shocking encounters from strange Airbnbs tucked away in Appalachian small towns. Each story is a chilling glimpse into the unknown. Places that seem normal at first, but hold secrets that will stay with you long after the video ends. Before we dive in, make sure you hit that subscribe button, drop a like if you enjoy the stories, and share this with anyone who loves true horror. I also want to hear from you. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments. All right, let's step inside these unsettling Airbnbs, if you dare. I remember pulling up to that Airbnb on the outskirts of the ridge, the kind of place that looks charming in the daylight, but turns uncanny once the sun drops behind the trees. It was a small, weather-beaten cabin with peeling white paint and a sagging porch. Behind it, just a few dozen yards into the overgrown field, stood the barn. Dilapidated with rotting boards and a roof that sagged like it might collapse under its own weight. The locals at the gas station had warned me about it, not in any playful tourist way, but seriously, with grim looks and hushed tones. "Don't go near that barn," one old man had said, tapping the side of his nose like he expected me to understand some unspoken danger. I had laughed it off. Appalachia has plenty of old superstitions. I chalked it up to folklore meant to scare outsiders. The first night was uneventful, the kind of quiet that makes every creak of the cabin louder than it should be. The wind whispered through the trees and rattled the window frames, and I convinced myself I was just hearing normal sounds. The settling of old timber, the occasional animal out in the dark. But sometime after midnight, I woke to a faint sound that didn't belong. At first, I couldn't place it, like a murmur caught on the edge of hearing. Footsteps, very light, moving across the loft above the barn. Only there wasn't supposed to be anyone there. I froze, straining to catch the rhythm, and then I heard it again, a low, almost human whisper, but broken, stuttering, like someone was trying to say words they didn't quite remember. I told myself it was the wind. I told myself it was rats, maybe squirrels getting into the eaves. But there's a certain way a whisper carries through a space, even a large empty loft, that your gut recognizes. This wasn't that. This was deliberate. It was close. Too close. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and headed for the barn. The porch boards creaked under my boots, and the moonlight made the peeling paint look like flaking skin. When I stepped into the barn, the air smelled of rot and old hay. Shadows clung to every corner. The loft above me looked precarious, planks twisted, nails jutting at odd angles. I hesitated at the ladder. Every instinct in me screamed to leave, but something, maybe stubborn curiosity, maybe a foolish sense of bravery, made me climb. The ladder groaned with each step. I kept thinking about what the locals had said. The whispered warnings that had sounded so childish back at the gas station now rang clear in my head. I reached the loft, and the boards beneath me moaned, like the barn itself was protesting my intrusion. I swept the flashlight around. Nothing. Just dust motes dancing in the beam, old broken crates, a few long-forgotten tools. I called out, half hoping someone would answer, half hoping they wouldn't. Silence. Then the whisper again, closer now, and coming from beneath the floor this time. It wasn't yelling. Not really, but it was insistent. Patient. I froze, heart hammering, listening as the words, if they could be called that, shifted and floated beneath my feet. I couldn't make them out, but it sounded like it was breathing, thinking, aware of me. I wanted to jump down and run, but my body refused. I was stuck there, on the edge of that loft, feeling like whatever had been speaking had been watching me for hours, following my every move. The barn smelled worse than before, like damp earth and decay, like something had been lying in the soil too long. I tried to shake off the fear, telling myself it was a raccoon, a possum, something that had climbed up into the loft. But rational thought didn't fit anymore. Every instinct screamed that whatever it was, it had been under the floor the entire time. Morning came slow and gray, the kind of dawn that barely touches the world with light. I didn't sleep. I sat in the cabin with coffee I couldn't taste, staring out at the barn. The mist clung to the field, curling around the long grass like fingers. Finally, I forced myself to go outside to see the damage, or lack of it, from last night. My boots crunched over frost-hardened dirt as I circled the barn. That's when I saw the marks. Sharp, deep scratches dug into the earth beneath the barn, claw-like, jagged, and unmistakably fresh. Not from a raccoon, not from a dog. These were human-sized, and they were deliberate. I backed away, heart thudding. Something had been under that floor the entire time, moving quietly, watching, whispering. I wanted to leave immediately, but my car was still half a mile down the dirt road. The thought of retracing my steps past the barn was unbearable, but I couldn't abandon the trail of marks. They trailed just far enough to show movement, disappearing into the overgrowth as though whatever made them had melted into the morning mist. Even now, months later, I can't explain what happened. I've gone back in my memory, trying to find a rational explanation. Maybe it was a vagrant, maybe a feral person living beneath that barn, surviving in the dirt and shadows. But the whispers, the way they came from beneath the boards while I was standing above, the patience and intelligence behind them, that's what lingers. That's what terrifies me. The claw marks proved it wasn't imagination, and even if I wanted to, I couldn't unhear those voices. The locals never explained it, and I didn't ask. There's an understanding in this region about certain things. You don't pry. You don't go looking where the land and its people suggest you shouldn't. And I learned that too late. I learned that some warnings aren't superstition. Some are memory, passed down from people who know what prowls the edges of the forests. They know the old barns, the abandoned homesteads, the spots where the earth itself seems to swallow light. They leave marks, leave whispers, and they wait. I never went back to that cabin. I told myself it was a one-time thing, a strange coincidence, maybe a person hiding beneath the barn for reasons I couldn't fathom. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of those whispers. I hear them beneath my bed, under the floorboards of my own home, echoing the same cadence, the same patient insistence. And I know in the cold certainty of memory that they were real. They were below me the entire time, moving, waiting, listening. The claw marks are still fresh in my mind, as sharp as the moment I saw them in the dirt, proof that the barn was not empty. Proof that some things, no matter how isolated or seemingly forgotten, still breathe, still watch. I've driven past other old barns since, and I can't look away from them. Something in me expects the same whispers, the same patient presence, just waiting under the floorboards. I never speak about it, not to friends, not to strangers. People would call me paranoid. They would say I was imagining it. But I know the truth. And it isn't comforting. The fear isn't about being caught or attacked. It's about the knowledge that something watches quietly beneath our feet and that its patience outlasts our courage. I still hear it sometimes, faint, almost indistinguishable from the wind, and I feel it beneath me, wherever I go. The memory of that night sits like a weight in my chest. I can picture the loft, the rickety boards, the moonlight spilling across the dusty hay, and I can still hear the whispers echoing from the soil beneath. It wasn't sudden, and it wasn't wild. It was deliberate, and it was waiting. I can't tell you why I didn't run immediately. Maybe I thought understanding it would make me safe. Maybe I didn't believe it was real until I saw the claw marks. But seeing them, that raw, tangible proof of what had been lurking, changed me. It left me knowing that some places aren't meant for the living, and some presences are patient enough to wait out anyone who dares to tread above them. The barn still stands in my mind, dark and leaning, and the whispers are still there. Just out of reach, beneath the floor, patient, alive, waiting for the next person to climb that rickety ladder. Even writing this now, I feel the shiver at the base of my spine. I can almost hear it again, the quiet, cautious breathing beneath the floorboards, the stuttered, unformed words drifting upward, patient and human enough to make you question everything. And I know, without doubt, that it's still there. It never left. I remember the drive up to that Airbnb like it's burned into my memory. The long, twisting road through the holler, lined with thick trees that seemed to swallow the sunlight. The host met me at the gravel driveway, a thin, weathered woman with hands tucked into her coat pockets, eyes sharp and assessing. She smiled, but there was an edge to it, a warning I didn't understand at the time. "Don't talk to Mr. Harlow," she said, almost casually, like it was a household rule she expected me to respect. I laughed it off. Who was Mr. Harlow? Some neighbor with too much time on his hands. I didn't ask questions. I told myself it was one of those Appalachian eccentricities you hear about, a story that keeps people on edge for no good reason. The Airbnb itself was modest, a small cabin tucked near the edge of the property, surrounded by unkempt grass and clusters of trees that leaned toward the house like spectators. Inside, it smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp carpet, the kind of smell that clings to your clothes long after you leave. That first night I settled in, unpacked my things, and tried to ignore the silence. Out there, away from the hum of the town, the quiet has a weight to it, like it presses against your ears and makes ordinary sounds feel enormous. I stayed up later than usual, reading by flashlight, the wind shifting through the trees, rattling the window panes. That's when I saw him for the first time. He was standing by the property line just beyond the reach of the porch light, a shadow at the edge of the clearing. I froze, heart thudding, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the trees, a pile of firewood stacked just right. But no, he was there, tall, hunched slightly, hands at his sides, his head turned slowly, almost deliberately, as if he had been waiting, watching me without a sound. I blinked, and he was gone, swallowed by the darkness, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't moved at all, that the night itself had held him there for me to see. The next evening, the feeling of being watched didn't let up. When I stepped out to hang my laundry, I thought I caught sight of him again, closer this time, just at the edge of the tree line. I told myself it was impossible. I'd never seen him in daylight, never heard him speak, never had proof he existed. Yet I felt the weight of those eyes on me as if they followed every movement, and I caught myself scanning the woods, trying to locate a face that refused to show itself. Sleep became uneasy. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made my heart jump, imagining the same figure waiting silently somewhere just out of reach. By the third night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I stepped out after dinner, flashlight in hand, intending to confront whatever it was. My pulse raced as I scanned the clearing, the beam cutting through the darkness, landing on nothing but grass and trees. I called his name, a nervous laugh on my lips, but only the wind answered. I stepped closer to where I thought I'd seen him before, and the forest floor gave way to footprints, bear, long and thin, leading from the clearing and disappearing into the tree line. I crouched, tracing them with my flashlight. The soil was soft from recent rain, the impressions fresh. No tracks led toward the cabin, only into the forest. And for a moment, I thought maybe someone had been living out there, hiding just beyond sight. Every trip to town became a subtle ordeal. When I returned, unloading groceries or stretching my legs after a long drive, I felt the same pair of eyes tracking me, just at the edge of vision, vanishing the second I turned to look directly. It was the same unsettling certainty I'd felt the first night. He was always there, patient, persistent, waiting somewhere in the shadows. I stopped taking the long route back, sticking to the straight gravel driveway, but it didn't matter. The feeling followed me, wrapping around the edges of my awareness. The nights grew heavier. The wind through the trees carried unfamiliar sounds now, faint and human enough to set my imagination racing. I would hear footsteps along the edge of the porch, just beyond the reach of the light, sometimes accompanied by a low murmur, too soft to catch any words, but deliberate, measured. I began locking doors I hadn't before, sliding the bolt across the cabin windows. Yet nothing ever broke the silence with a loud crash or a shout. The presence didn't need noise to be terrifying. Its quiet patience was worse than any scream. On the fourth night, I couldn't bear it any longer. I left the cabin, driving down the winding road under a sky heavy with stars, trying to convince myself it had been paranoia, the isolation playing tricks on my mind. That's when I saw him again, standing at the tree line where the forest met the clearing. Far enough that I didn't get a good look, but close enough for me to feel the weight of his gaze through the windshield. I slammed the car into gear, heart hammering, and tried to disappear down the mountain road, but in the rearview mirror, he didn't move. He stayed there, unmoving, watching. I pressed harder on the accelerator, every mile carrying me further from him, but the memory of those eyes burned itself into my chest, the certainty of being watched not fading with distance. I didn't stay the week. I left early, abandoning the quiet solitude I'd hoped to find, leaving the cabin and the small Airbnb behind. But even as the forest receded in the rearview mirror, I could still see him in the corners of my mind, standing at the edge of the tree line. There was no rational explanation I could settle on. People say Appalachia breeds tall tales, that the woods and mountains hold stories to scare children. But what I experienced wasn't a story. It wasn't something I imagined. He existed, however untraceable, however silent, however patient. Months later, I still see him sometimes, in fleeting shadows along back roads, or at the edge of the trees near a friend's farm. My eyes catch that same posture, that same deliberate, still presence, and my stomach drops. I have never spoken of him outside of a few trusted people, because I can't explain him, and nobody would believe me. But I know what I saw. I know the oppressive patience, the quiet insistence, the way a human being, or whatever he is, can linger on the periphery of your life and make you feel small, exposed, and helpless. There is a grief to it, the loss of innocence, the knowledge that isolation can make a person vulnerable to more than the cold or the dark. That cabin, that clearing, and the tree line at the edge of the property left something inside me that didn't go away when I drove back to civilization. I can recall the exact angle where he stood, where the shadow of the trees sliced across the clearing. I can remember the feel of those eyes pressing down on me without looking, waiting, patient, unmoving. Even the soft rustle of leaves now carries that memory, and for a moment, the hair on my neck rises, and I feel him again, watching. I've driven past other rural properties since, old barns, abandoned homes, and I catch myself glancing at the tree lines, expecting that same still figure. He is always there in memory, quiet and patient. I don't know why he was at that cabin, why he lingered when no one else was around, why he refused to make a sound. All I know is that he existed on the edge of my vision, a living question I could neither answer nor escape. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can see him, just standing there at the edge of the forest, silent and unmoving, watching the world go by while I drive further from him, trying in vain to convince myself that distance can erase the weight of eyes that never blink, never waver, never leave. And I understand, in a way that chills me still, that some presences are patient enough to wait until you are ready, or until you realize you might never be ready at all. I thought I'd found the perfect getaway. The farmhouse was tucked deep in the hollow, far from any main road, nestled between thick stands of pine and oak. The listing made it sound idyllic, a rustic retreat where you could forget the world for a while. I arrived in the late afternoon, sunlight breaking through the trees in mottled patches, dust motes floating in the quiet air. The house itself was small, with peeling white paint and a sagging porch, but it had a charm to it, the sort that made you want to stay inside, drink coffee, and listen to the wind through the treetops. I was alone, which I thought would be a good thing, a chance to write, to breathe. The first night was quiet in that way Appalachian nights can be, the kind that makes you feel both safe and small at the same time. I unpacked my bag, made a fire in the old stove, and sat with a beer, listening to the forest sigh around the house. That's when I noticed the door. It was at the top of the narrow staircase leading to the attic. Heavy, wooden, and oddly out of place compared to the rest of the house. It had a tarnished brass knob and a deep, stubborn lock. There was no key, and I didn't think much of it at first. Probably the previous owners stored junk up there. But that night, as I lay in bed, I began to hear it. Faint at first, like nails scratching against wood. I froze, heart hammering, straining to catch any pattern. The sound stopped. I tried to laugh it off, told myself it was the old house settling, the wind shifting through the rafters. Still, I didn't sleep well. Each creak of the floorboards downstairs made me tense, and I found myself staring at that attic door in the dim light, imagining shapes moving behind it. The second night, the scratching returned. Louder this time. It seemed deliberate, like someone or something was testing the lock, trying to push it open from the other side. My first instinct was to dismiss it, but the sound carried a rhythm, a slow, deliberate scratching that made my skin crawl. I sat in the living room with a flashlight, listening. It stopped whenever I shone the beam at the stairs. That only made the house feel more alive, as if it was watching me back, waiting. I thought about leaving, but I didn't. There was a stubborn curiosity, and something about the isolation made me feel a twisted sense of ownership, like I had stumbled onto a secret that belonged to no one else. By the third night, the scratching had become unmistakable, sharp and urgent. It would start low, near the door frame, then move along the wood in irregular patterns. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a raccoon got in through the eaves, or squirrels had nested in the rafters. But the sound didn't move, didn't come from the vents or walls. It stayed just behind the attic door. I could almost feel it, pressing against the wood, patient and persistent. On the fourth day, I noticed a loose floorboard in the corner of the living room, near the base of the staircase. I didn't know what made me lift it, some idle curiosity I couldn't shake. My fingers found something cold and metallic underneath, a small brass key, tarnished and heavy. My stomach twisted. There was no label, no explanation, only the key. My hands shook as I carried it upstairs, fitting it into the lock. The door clicked open with an almost reluctant groan, as though it hadn't been touched in decades. Inside, the attic smelled of mildew and dust, a thick, oppressive air that made my chest tighten. Old furniture lay haphazardly, a rocking chair with a threadbare cushion, trunks stacked atop one another, and piles of clothes yellowed with age. Sunlight filtered weakly through a small round window, catching motes of dust in the air. I stepped carefully, expecting the scratching to stop once I'd opened the door. It didn't. It was coming from the far corner, near a large wooden trunk. The lid was scratched and worn, dark stains along its edges. My heart thumped as I approached. I didn't want to look inside, but something compelled me to. I lifted the lid slowly. It was empty, or at least I couldn't see anything immediately. The air inside smelled faintly of iron and rot, and then it hit me. The scratching had moved. Inside the trunk, beneath the folds of old clothes, nails tapped against wood with a methodical rhythm. Something small, yet impossibly strong, was clawing from within. I slammed the lid shut, adrenaline spiking, and stepped back. My breath came in ragged gasps. The sound didn't stop entirely, muffled now but insistent, a reminder that whatever was in there hadn't been trapped by time or dust. I tried to leave, tried to laugh at my own fear, but the house had changed. The air was heavier, the shadows longer, and the floorboards beneath me creaked in ways I couldn't ignore. That night, sleep was impossible. I sat in the living room, eyes wide, listening to the muted tapping from above, imagining what had been hiding there all those years. The next morning, I packed quickly. My stomach churned at the thought of another night, the memory of that trunk and the scratching that hadn't stopped, only slowed. Outside, the forest was calm, deceptively so, with sunlight streaming through the trees and birds calling in the distance. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something followed me with my every step, something that had been waiting for me to leave its prison. Driving away, I looked back once. The house seemed empty, inert, but I knew better. I imagined the attic door closed, the trunk waiting, and somewhere deep inside it, the scratching beginning again, patient and unyielding. It wasn't malicious in the way you see in movies. It wasn't a ghost screaming for vengeance, nor a shadow demon lurking in corners. It was quieter, more deliberate, persistent, something meant to endure, to be noticed and ignored in equal measure. Weeks later, I could still hear it in my mind. At night, when the wind rattled the windows or a tree scraped against the roof, the sound would return, faint and insistent. I couldn't tell if it was a memory or something else, as though the house had left a piece of itself in me. Friends asked why I'd rented a place so isolated, and I told them about the charm of a small farmhouse in the woods. I left out the door, the trunk, the scratching. They wouldn't understand. I've avoided that part of the country ever since. I've tried to rationalize it. Rodents, house settling, my imagination. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt. That attic, that trunk, held something that didn't belong to the living world. Something older, stubborn, and patient. Every creak, every groan of wood in my own home now reminds me of it, as if the sound left a ghost of itself in my ears. A warning, a memory, or a curse. I've tried to write it off as paranoia, but I can't. I don't know why it wanted me to find the key. I don't know why it waited, why it scratched, why it seemed almost aware of my presence. Maybe it was just time, and the trunk and the attic marking the passage of years. Maybe it was something else, something alive in its own way. I'll never know. All I know is the memory, that slow, methodical scratching echoing from wood to air, never ceasing entirely, even now in the quiet of my apartment far from the woods. I never returned to that Airbnb. I can't. And even as I tell this story, months later, I feel the weight of it pressing down, reminding me that some things are meant to remain undiscovered, that some doors are locked for a reason, and that curiosity in a place like that is a dangerous thing. The house sits there still, in the hollow, surrounded by trees that have grown taller, thicker, denser with each passing year. And somewhere in the attic, behind that door, behind that trunk, the scratching goes on, patient, deliberate, unending, waiting for the next person who thinks they can ignore it, dismiss it, or survive it. I arrived at the cabin just as the fog rolled down the valley. Thick, heavy, it swallowed the road and the trees, leaving only gray shapes in front of me. From the car, the little wooden cabin looked almost cozy. Dark wood, moss-covered rocks, pine trees leaning close, like they were whispering to each other. The moment I stepped onto the porch, though, I felt it. A silence that wasn't right. It wasn't just quiet. It was deliberate, like the world had been holding its breath. Inside, everything looked normal. A small bed, a table, a lantern in the corner. I unpacked slowly, trying to tell myself the tension I felt was just nerves. The kind that come from being alone in the mountains. But even then, every creak of the wood, every groan from the cabin seemed like it was meant for me. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, thick enough that I couldn't see the edge of the clearing. I told myself it was nothing. Just fog. Just isolation. Night came fast. The fire in the fireplace cast shadows that flickered across the walls, making the room feel larger than it was, like someone could be hiding just out of reach. And that's when I heard it. At first, soft, almost a whisper carried on the wind. I thought it was the trees. But then it wasn't. It was footsteps, careful, pacing just outside. Slow at first, then circling, lingering near the porch. My heart thumped. I stayed very still, pressed against the wall. The footsteps stopped. Then I saw them. Footprints, faint but clear, leading up to the porch, and then back into the trees. Nobody was there. I stared at them until I couldn't breathe, tracing them with my eyes, trying to understand. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak, every rustle felt deliberate, like it had a purpose I couldn't grasp. And then came the whispers. At first, incoherent, just sounds carried through the fog, almost like the wind, but later I swear I could make out words. Low, soft, coaxing, pulling me toward the woods. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the mind, that isolation made you hear things. But it wasn't. It felt alive, watching, waiting. The fog thickened until I couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. I thought about leaving, walking back down the road to my car, but every step forward felt like sinking into something I couldn't understand. Shadows shifted at the edges of my vision. The whispers pressed against my mind, urging me, calling me deeper into the forest. My hands shook as I fumbled for the door latch. When I finally opened it, the fog pressed in, wet and cold, hiding everything. I stepped outside, and the ground was soft, damp. Every crunch of gravel echoed far too loudly. I looked back at the cabin, but it seemed farther away than it should have been. I walked the perimeter, trying to keep my bearings, but the fog was disorienting, folding the clearing in on itself. The whispers came again, higher now, almost urgent. I told myself to leave, to run, but the road had disappeared. My car was there somewhere, I thought, but when I tried to find it, the shapes of trees and rocks shifted under the fog. I could have been walking in circles, and the feeling of being watched didn't leave. Every step made me feel smaller, like the forest itself had noticed me and was keeping score. By morning, I found the car and drove away, slow, every shadow along the roadside making my stomach twist. Even as I reached the highway, even as the fog lifted and the light returned, I couldn't shake it. The cabin hadn't been on any map. Nobody had heard of it. I tried to find the listing again, the road, anything, but there was nothing. Locals looked at me strangely when I asked, some warning me, some shaking their heads, muttering about fog and lost places that appear only sometimes, for reasons no one can explain. I've never gone back. I don't know if I want to. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I hear whispers again, faint, coaxing from nowhere. And sometimes I think about the footprints circling the porch in the fog, and I wonder if whatever was out there is still waiting, just beyond the edge of the world I know, in a place that doesn't exist on any map. I booked the Airbnb because I needed quiet. Real quiet, the kind you only get on the far end of a dirt road where the trees press close and the sky looks heavier than it should. The listing called it a mountain cabin retreat, but it was more like an old hunting shack someone had swept out and decided to rent for cash. The porch sagged, the boards were soft in places, and the smell of old pine clung to everything. But I didn't mind. I'd been feeling burnt out, strung tight in a way I couldn't explain. Isolation felt like the only cure. The owner left the key under a rock beside the steps. When I first walked across the porch, the boards groaned under my weight, long, slow creaks that echoed through the hollow. It was the kind of sound that made you glance over your shoulder. Still, I settled in. I made a simple dinner, sat on the porch for a while, listened to the woods whisper. The sun went down behind the ridge, and everything fell into that Appalachian darkness, thick, unmoving, like ink poured across the world. Inside, the cabin was sparse. A cot, a small wood stove, a metal table that wobbled whenever I touched it. I told myself I'd only be there for 2 nights, just enough time to breathe. I remember lying on that cot, staring at the ceiling as the last light drained from the window. The kind of silence that took over wasn't peaceful. It was too complete. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Sometime after midnight, the porch creaked again. Not just once. Not from cooling wood or shifting temperature. Footsteps. Heavy. Slow. One step, then another. Boards bending in a rhythmic pace like someone was walking the length of the porch. I froze, every muscle in my body going tight. The sound was unmistakable. Weight shifting heel to toe, passing from one end of the porch to the other. My mind went to the worst possibilities. A bear, some drunk local, a stranger who'd been watching me since I arrived. I sat up in bed and held my breath, listening. The pacing stopped right outside the door. You know the feeling of staring at something you can't see, that instinctive awareness of presence. The air felt charged, like whatever stood on the other side of that thin wooden wall knew I was awake, knew I was listening. I waited, counted my own breaths. The footsteps moved again, this time slower. I heard the wood complain beneath each step as it circled the cabin. A full loop, then another. It kept circling, circling, circling. Never hurrying, never stopping. I finally worked up the nerve to slip out of bed and approach the window. The moon was faint, barely a sliver between clouds. My hands shook as I pushed a finger under the curtain and lifted it. I saw nothing, no shape. No movement, just the empty porch, wrapped in darkness. But the footsteps kept going, passing directly beneath me, crossing the boards right where I was looking. There's a kind of horror that comes when your senses disagree with each other. My eyes said the porch was empty. My ears insisted something was walking there. The disconnect made bile rise in my throat. I grabbed my phone, turned the camera toward the porch, and hit record. I filmed 10 minutes of footsteps pacing in a slow, methodical circle. Even zoomed in, even straining my eyes until they watered. Nothing. Just the porch boards shifting under invisible weight. When the sound finally stopped, it didn't fade. It didn't trail off. It just cut out mid-step, like a switch flipped. I stayed awake till dawn, too scared to lie down, too scared to close my eyes. When the first hint of light came through the window, I stepped outside. The cold morning air hit me, and for a moment I thought I'd imagined everything. The woods were calm, silent, drenched in mist. I walked across the porch slowly, testing each board with my foot. The wood still groaned, still bent. Then I saw them. Not footprints, not exactly. The boards had long scratch marks, fresh and bright against the gray wood. Not random either. They formed a circle, an almost perfect ring around where the cabin's walls met the porch floor. Tight, deliberate, each line dragging inward, as though something had traced the same path for hours. I knelt down, running my fingers along one of the scratches. They weren't from an animal. Too straight, too uniform, more like dragging nails or fingers. A sickening thought settled over me. Whatever had paced around me in the night hadn't been outside looking in. It had been keeping me inside. I pulled out my phone, heart hammering, wanting to prove to myself that what I heard was real. I opened the video. The porch was right there, empty and still. But the audio? Nothing. Total silence. Even though I clearly remembered the constant thumping footsteps, the pacing rhythm, the groaning boards, it captured none of it. Just quiet. Too quiet. That's when I realized something else. Every time the footsteps had passed directly by the door, the knob had trembled. Slightly. So slight I convinced myself it was my imagination. But the more I replayed the night in my head, the clearer it became. Something had been testing the door. Slowly. Patiently. I started packing immediately. As I shoved my clothes into my bag, I kept hearing that pacing rhythm replaying in my head, like my memory wouldn't let it go. With every item I packed, the dread settled deeper, like the cabin itself didn't want me leaving. I half expected to hear the porch creak again, footsteps returning now that I was trying to escape, but the woods stayed silent. I stepped outside and locked the cabin behind me, though I knew the lock had never mattered. The forest felt different now. As I walked down the steps, a sharp breeze cut between the trees, carrying a sound I didn't notice at first, a faint dragging somewhere far behind the cabin, like something heavy moving across wood. I didn't look back. Halfway down the path to my car, my phone buzzed unexpectedly. A notification from the Airbnb owner. I almost ignored it, thinking it was some automated message, but something made me check. It was short. "Hey, did you leave already? Neighbors said they heard someone walking around the property last night. Don't leave food out. That attracts them." Them. The word made my chest tighten. I responded immediately, fingers shaking. "What do you mean by them?" The reply came a minute later. "Locals. People who live out in the woods. They keep to themselves. Sometimes they wander onto the porch at night. Just ignore them. They never try the door." My blood went cold. Never try the door. I stared at those words, feeling the air thicken around me. The owner said it so casually, as if it were part of mountain life, a harmless quirk. But I remembered the knob trembling. I remembered the deliberate pacing circling me over and over. I remembered the scratches, too perfect, too precise to be made by someone wandering aimlessly. And the footsteps, heavy, steady, slow, like someone who knew the rhythm of that porch better than I did. Someone who'd done it before. I didn't reply. I didn't ask more questions. I got in my car and drove. Fast, the gravel road spitting dust behind me. I didn't stop until the cabin vanished completely from the rearview mirror. But even now, months later, I can't sleep on quiet nights. Because sometimes in that heavy silence, I hear it again. A creak, a slow step, boards bending under weight that isn't there. And I realize the most disturbing part isn't that something walked around me all night long. It's that whatever it was, feral or human or something in between, it made no noise in the recording, like it didn't exist in the world the way I do, like it wasn't meant to be heard unless you were there, alone, listening. And sometimes, when I think about those perfect circular scratches, I wonder if it wasn't walking around me at all. I wonder if it was drawing something, a circle, a boundary, a warning, or maybe a claim. The first night I arrived, the forest was already holding its breath. The cabin sat at the edge of a small clearing, half swallowed by pines and oaks, and the fog hung thick among the trunks like it didn't want me to see beyond the first row of trees. I'd parked on the gravel drive, listening to the crunch beneath my tires, and already felt the weight of the silence pressing against the car. The cabin itself looked abandoned at first glance. Weathered boards, a sagging roof, a single window that faced the woods like a watchful eye. I didn't mind. That kind of isolation was exactly what I'd come for, though I didn't yet realize the kind of presence the forest could hold when you're alone. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and pine resin. The furniture was sparse, a small table, a cot, and a rocking chair that creaked when the wind brushed the walls. The large window in the living room was impossible to ignore, filling the space with the deep shadows of trees. During the day it felt peaceful, almost meditative. But at night I could feel something shift, something quiet settling over the clearing. The first evening I slept fitfully, waking to the slightest rustle outside, convincing myself it was just the trees swaying, animals moving through underbrush. But even then, I felt eyes, unseen and patient, following me across the room. By the second night, it became harder to ignore. Shadows began flitting between the trees, subtle at first, like wind-stirred branches. Then I noticed they weren't moving like the wind. They would freeze, just at the edge of the clearing, lingering in place for moments that felt impossibly long. I tried pulling the curtains, thinking I could shut them out, but it didn't help. I could still feel them, the way their stillness seemed to press against the glass, as if the air itself had weight. Sometimes, when I woke in the dark hours, I thought I saw faint shapes, crouched low, watching. I would blink, and they were gone. Only the sense of being observed remained. It started small, the first faint smears on the glass, tiny handprints at the bottom of the window pane. I didn't notice them at first, not in daylight, but they were there, fresh and sticky with dew some mornings. My fingers trembled when I touched them, half expecting the prints to vanish or retreat under my hand. I cleaned them off, tried to tell myself it was just dirt or sap, but each night they returned in the same spots, always small, always deliberate, as if someone, or something, was pressing against the glass to make its presence known. I called the host, trying to sound calm, and they laughed it off. "Oh, that's just the woods," they said. "You'll see, sometimes kids or wanderers pass through. Nothing to worry about. The property is perfectly safe." I wanted to believe them, but the instinct in my chest told me otherwise. The shadows didn't behave like animals or humans. They lingered. They waited. And that waiting was heavier than any threat I could name. By the third night, I no longer slept near the window. I turned my cot so my back faced it, tried drawing the blinds all the way down. But even in the darkness, I could feel it. The subtle pressure of something just beyond the glass, patient and silent. The air in the room carried it, or maybe my imagination had finally sharpened to the point where I couldn't tell the difference. Every time I turned in my sleep, I felt a small brush of cold, like a fingertip barely grazing my skin. I would wake, heart racing, and see nothing. Only the shadows beyond the window perfectly still, waiting. I began keeping a journal, noting every movement, every strange sensation. The pattern was undeniable. They were always there at night, always lingering near the window, and the handprints always appeared in the same places. Small, almost childlike, yet impossibly precise. I tried reasoning it away. Forest legends, local kids playing tricks, my own exhaustion. But the more I wrote, the more the presence pressed in, silent and unyielding. The final night, fog rolled in thick, blanketing the clearing in gray that obscured the forest beyond. I left every light on in the cabin, hoping that brightness would keep whatever it was at bay. But the shapes didn't retreat. The air itself seemed heavier, the stillness of the shadows pressing through the glass. I could see them faintly, crouched or low, just out of reach, watching the glow inside. I stayed on the cot, paralyzed by the need to move but unable to, every muscle tense, every nerve screaming. The handprints appeared once more, pressed faintly against the glass, and I knew without seeing that they weren't random. They had been marking me, circling me with the quiet patience of something that could wait forever. I packed silently at first light, careful not to draw attention, careful not to glance at the window. My hands shook, but I forced them to work. Every time I moved, I imagined the weight of those unseen eyes following me. The host's earlier assurances rang hollow, and I no longer cared about explanations. Some things are meant to remain unknown. I locked the cabin behind me, but the presence didn't leave. I could feel it even as I drove away, in the periphery of my vision, in the spaces between headlights and rearview mirrors. Back in town, I tried rationalizing it. Children playing, animal tracks, the forest itself creating illusions. But rationalizations do little when your memory is haunted by patient silence, by shapes that don't move except to observe. I cannot shake the sense that the forest holds its secrets deliberately, and that whatever waits outside windows like that one is neither in a hurry nor interested in being discovered. It simply exists, and it waits. Even now, months later, I avoid cabins with large windows facing the woods. I sleep with the lights on when I can, and I rarely look outside at night, but in moments of quiet, I still feel it. The patient presence, watching just beyond the glass, silent and steady. I know I was not alone in that cabin. I know that someone or something observed me as I slept, and I know I left without ever fully understanding what it was or what it wanted. The forest keeps its secrets, and I will never stop feeling that I glimpsed one, even if I never see it again. I found the guest book on a dusty shelf near the fireplace, wedged between a stack of old maps and a chipped ceramic vase. The cabin smelled faintly of mildew and pine resin, the kind of smell that lingers even after a thorough cleaning, and I remember thinking it was charming in that weathered, forgotten way. The book itself was leather-bound, the edges frayed, the pages yellowed with age. At first, I flipped casually through the entries, tourists writing about hikes, the peaceful woods, the quiet solitude. Everything seemed ordinary. But then, scattered among the mundane notes, I began to notice the oddities, phrases that made my stomach tighten and my pulse jump. He watches after dark. Don't fall asleep. The handwriting was uneven, sometimes shaky, sometimes almost elegant, but always deliberate. And every time I turned a page, I felt the temperature drop in the room, as if the words themselves carried weight. I tried to laugh it off at first. Maybe it was a joke, some local prank meant to thrill unsuspecting visitors. The cabin was old. People liked leaving marks, little echoes of themselves for others to find. But the more I read, the less I felt like I was alone. The entries didn't feel like the residue of past guests. They felt immediate, fresh, urgent. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. I left the book on the shelf and tried to focus on making myself comfortable, lighting a fire in the small stove and unpacking quietly. The wind pressed against the windows, sighing through the cracks in the frame, and I felt, without explanation, a presence in the room, just beyond the firelight, watching me. By the second night, the unease had grown into something heavier. I woke to the sound of scratching, faint at first, almost like fingernails dragging along wood. It came from the corner of the living room, near a wall where the shadows pooled thickly. I froze, heart hammering, listening as the sound stopped abruptly when I strained to pinpoint it. I told myself it was the house settling, an animal perhaps, but my rational thoughts felt hollow against the sense of being observed. I noticed then that the guest book had been moved slightly, its leather cover now resting at a different angle than I had left it. I hadn't touched it. The thought of someone else in the cabin was absurd. The door was locked, windows closed, but I could not shake the sensation of eyes on me, just beyond the firelight. Later that night, I was brushing my teeth when I caught a glimpse of something on the wall in the reflection of the mirror. Shaky, dark lines that hadn't been there before, forming letters, almost as if scrawled in haste. Stay awake. My hand froze on the toothbrush, my reflection blurred by panic. I turned slowly, eyes scanning every corner of the room. The walls were otherwise empty, but the message remained, tangible in its presence, as if it had been written in the air itself. I ripped open the guest book again, scanning for similar warnings, and found one entry that chilled me to the bone. The corner sees everything. Sleep, and it comes closer. I snapped the book shut and sat on the edge of the cot, knees drawn to my chest, listening to the wind against the cabin and the faint creak of floorboards that could have been nothing, or could have been the weight of something unseen moving just beyond the edge of light. I began to notice the subtle things, shadows that clung longer than they should have, whispers of movement when I was alone. At first, I tried to ignore them, but the messages continued, appearing in places I would have sworn were clean. Behind the rocking chair, faint scratches on the wall near the stove, the words, "He waits," in jagged script that looked hurried, anxious, desperate. My skin crawled every time I saw them. I began keeping the lights on, leaving the fire burning even when it was hot enough to make the room uncomfortable, hoping that illumination could hold the presence at bay. But the feeling of being watched was relentless, pressing against my back even when I moved from room to room. By the third night, the dread had become unbearable. I could no longer sit still. I spent hours pacing, eyes darting to corners where shadows pooled unnaturally. I noticed faint marks, like fingernail scratches, along the baseboards, almost too precise to be accidental. Each time I turned, I expected to see a figure lurking just beyond the edge of vision, crouched in patience. I hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't seen shapes moving directly, but the implication was clear. The cabin was not empty. I was not alone. The messages on the walls weren't random. The warnings in the guest book weren't idle. They were guidance, or perhaps threats, left by others who had glimpsed the presence before me. I tried to leave that night. I grabbed my keys, stuffed essentials into my bag, but when I reached the door, I froze. The words, "Don't go," had appeared on the inside of the door frame, scratched into the wood, small but deliberate. My hands shook as I reached for the doorknob, convinced that if I touched it, something would happen. I didn't open the door. Instead, I retreated to the cot, leaving the lights on, the fire burning low, and sat rigid in the silence. Outside, the forest was quiet, unnervingly so, and I felt that stillness seep into the cabin, pressing the air against my skin like a living thing. The fourth night was worse. The messages on the walls seemed to multiply overnight. Every time I turned my back, a new phrase appeared, written in the same jagged, unsteady hand. "Watch him. He waits. Sleep and it finds you." I tried to document them in my notebook, but the pen felt inadequate, unable to capture the weight of the presence that seemed to lurk in every corner. I would glance up, and the shadows shifted slightly, just enough to suggest movement. I could feel with terrifying clarity that I was being observed from places I couldn't see, from angles the light couldn't touch. My sleep, already fractured, became impossible. I stayed awake, pacing, listening, the wind outside whistling through the cracks like breath from some unseen throat. By dawn, I had made my decision. I packed quickly, silently, eyes never leaving the corners of the room. Every scuff on the floor, every scratch on the walls, every word written in haste was a warning I no longer wished to test. I left the guest book where I had found it, but I could feel the weight of those messages following me, echoing in my mind long after the cabin faded behind the trees. The forest remained silent as I drove away, but the presence of the messages, the warnings, the sense of being watched, lingered with me. Even now, months later, I avoid cabins with large windows or old wooden floors. I cannot erase the memory of those nights, the creeping certainty that the house was alive in some way, patient and deliberate, and that I had been an unwitting participant in its quiet observation. Even writing this now, I feel a prickle along my spine, the faint pressure of eyes on the back of my neck. I do not know what it wanted, or why it chose to reveal itself in messages and whispers rather than motion or sound. I only know that the warnings were real, and the presence was real, and I will never, in all my life, feel completely alone again, because I have been seen in the dark corners of a forgotten cabin in the woods by something that does not sleep and does not forgive. The Airbnb was tucked at the end of a long, twisting road, the kind that felt more like it belonged to the forest than any map. I'd driven for miles through hills that rose and fell like waves, trees pressing close to the edges of the narrow path, shadows pooling in ways that made the curves feel sharper than they were. When I arrived, the cabin seemed harmless. Weathered boards, a sagging porch, the faint smell of pine sap and old smoke, but the isolation hit immediately. There were no neighbors, no distant lights, only the hush of the forest pressing in from all sides. I told myself it was peaceful, exactly what I needed. Solitude, a chance to breathe. The first night passed quietly enough. I unpacked slowly, made a fire, and sat on the porch, listening to the wind through the treetops. The forest felt alive in its stillness, the kind of quiet that makes your own thoughts echo. I fell asleep without incident, lulled by the rhythmic groan of the old cabin. When I woke, morning light filtered through the pines, and I felt, foolishly, that the isolation was a comfort. On the second night, I realized I needed supplies. I drove into town, a small place a few miles down a more familiar road. and stocked up on coffee, bread, and firewood. The drive out was uneventful, and for a moment I thought the isolation of the cabin was behind me. But on the way back, everything changed. The familiar twists and bends I remembered had vanished. The road, the one I had driven earlier, was gone. Thick forest pressed right up to the hood of my car, trees leaning in close as though they had always been there. I laughed nervously at first. Maybe I had taken a wrong turn. I retraced my path, turning my wheel left, then right, expecting the cabin to appear at the end of the road. But no matter how far I drove, I ended up back where I had started. The cabin sat in the clearing exactly as I remembered. The gravel drive, the porch, even the leaning rocking chair. It was all the same. As I stepped out of the car, my hands shaking, a sense of panic welled up in me. How could the road vanish? How could the path I'd just traveled disappear into the forest like it had never existed? I tried again. I left the cabin early the next morning, deliberately mapping my way, noting every curve and landmark. Yet every trip ended the same way. Each time the road folded back onto itself, or vanished entirely, leaving nothing but trees. I felt my chest tighten with each failed attempt. I tried shouting, calling out, imagining that someone, or something, might respond. But the forest answered only with silence, the kind of absolute silence that presses against your ears and makes your heart beat loud enough to startle yourself. By the third day, I stopped trying to leave during daylight. I moved only within the clearing, convinced that the road existed only as long as I accepted it. The forest seemed aware, patient, holding me in the center of the hollow as if it were a living thing, and I had become its curiosity. At night, the darkness pressed against the windows, making the cabin feel smaller, the air heavier. I would wake in the middle of the night and hear the subtle sound of something moving among the trees just beyond the edges of the clearing. Footfalls that didn't match the weight of deer or any animal I knew, like the ground itself was shifting under unseen soul. Sleep became impossible. Each night I stayed awake, listening to the wind, the branches scraping, the faint pressure of the forest as if it leaned closer to watch. I could feel it pressing on me from every angle, patient and unyielding. I began locking the doors, shutting the windows, leaving lights on, but it didn't matter. The forest didn't care. The road's disappearance had nothing to do with chance. It was deliberate. Something beyond the trees controlled it, and by extension, controlled me. On the fourth night, I sat on the porch, knees drawn to my chest, staring into the dark mass of trunks that had replaced the road. The stars were visible, faint through the canopy, but they did nothing to comfort me. I kept replaying the drive over in my mind, every curve, every mile, every familiar bend that had ceased to exist. The realization came slowly, creeping like the chill that seeped into the cabin. The forest didn't just cover the road. It had claimed it. It could decide who traveled, when, and how. I understood in that moment that I was not free. I was merely allowed to exist within its boundaries. I tried to rationalize it. Was it a trick of light and memory? Exhaustion? The isolation making me hallucinate? But even in my rational moments, I knew I had no explanation. Every attempt to leave ended the same way. Every tree, every shadow, every line of sight confirmed the truth I could not deny. The road did not belong to me. It belonged to something else, something patient, something that allowed me to live only because it chose to. The nights grew longer. I no longer tried to escape, but neither did I sleep. I sat in the cabin with the lights on, staring at the forest, counting the seconds between the subtle rustling of leaves, the faint breaking of twigs under a weight that shouldn't exist. I imagined shapes moving just out of sight, creatures that didn't need to step into the clearing, their presence enough to remind me I was not alone. I thought about the people who had stayed in the cabin before me, and a dark certainty settled in my chest. This was not the first time the road had disappeared for someone. It would not be the last. By the fifth night, I realized the cabin itself had become a cage. The forest, the walls, the disappearing road, the lock. I could feel it in every shadow, every whisper of wind, every creak of old boards under my feet. The sense of being watched never left. Even when I closed my eyes, I felt it pressing against me, patient, silent, waiting. I could not escape it. I could not reason with it. I could only endure. I have not attempted to leave since. I sit on the porch during the day, keeping to the clearing, watching the forest, noting the subtle changes in the light, the angles of shadows, the way the trees seem to lean closer at certain hours. I speak to no one about it. I avoid roads entirely, and at night I leave every light on, though the forest does not flinch at them. I've come to accept that the road is not mine, that the clearing is not mine, that the forest decides who moves and who remains. And sometimes, when the wind shifts just right, when a branch scratches against a window or a distant tree groans under its own weight, I remember the drive that never ended and the terror that it meant. I remember that the forest does not need to act to control me. It simply waits. The first night I thought I was alone. By now I understand that solitude is only a permission. The forest is patient, and it is still waiting for the next traveler who believes a road is permanent, who believes they can leave when they choose. And I am learning, in the quiet, the weight of that patience, and the understanding that some things in these woods are not meant to be outrun, explained, or understood. I didn't think much about the fireplace when I first arrived. The Airbnb sat tucked into a quiet stretch of the Appalachian foothills, down a dirt road that twisted so sharply it felt like it was trying to tie itself shut. The cabin was older than the listing made it seem. Smooth logs gone gray with age, windows wavy with imperfections in the glass. But the stone fireplace, built from rough mountain rock, was what drew my eye the moment I stepped inside. It stood centered against the back wall like a monument, blackened with decades of soot, its mantle bowed slightly under its own weight. Old, sure, but charming in a way that made me think of warm nights, crackling wood, maybe even a sense of safety. During the day, the cabin felt harmless. Dust floated in strips of sunlight, and the wind pushed a soft smell of pine through the cracked window frames. But something about the fireplace kept tugging at me, drawing my attention even when I wasn't near it. It was cold and empty then, but the dark of the hearth seemed deeper than it should have been, like it held shadow better than the rest of the cabin. I shrugged it off. Old stone, old cabin, old mind playing tricks. I lit the fire the first night. It started normally, the wood popping and hissing as it caught, sending warm light spilling across the walls. I sat on the old couch with a blanket wrapped around me, feeling more relaxed than I had in months. That was the last time that room felt comforting. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of soft breathing. At first, I thought it was the wind catching one of the cracks in the cabin, but when I opened my eyes, the fire had burned low, just embers glowing faintly, and the sound was coming from the hearth itself. A slow, steady exhale. I sat there, frozen upright, listening to it. It wasn't the sound of wood settling. It wasn't the leftover hiss of a dying fire. It sounded like a person trying not to be heard. A thin thread of air pushed through stone. When I finally approached the fireplace, each step felt heavier than the last. I stood a few feet away, listening. For a moment, everything was silent. Then a sharp, sudden flare of the embers lit the hearth, the flames rising 2-3 inches higher without any fuel left to burn. The cabin warmed instantly, like someone had opened a furnace door. A breath of hot air swept across my face, and I recoiled instinctively. Then the flames settled back down, leaving only the soft red glow. I tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out small and shaky. I put out the remaining embers and went to bed, forcing myself not to look back at the hearth. But even under the blankets, with my back to the living room, I could still feel the warmth lingering on my cheek where that heat had touched me. The next morning, sunlight made the whole thing seem ridiculous. The fireplace looked normal again, the stone cold under my hand. I told myself it must have been a draft, a trick of heat. Old chimneys doing whatever old chimneys do. I even lit the stove to cook breakfast and pretended everything was fine. But that night, the sound returned. Softer this time, almost like someone whispering through a keyhole. A long exhale, then quiet. Another breath, slow and measured. I tried turning up the TV to drown it out, but the sound threaded beneath everything. It was subtle. So subtle, I thought maybe I was imagining it, but the cadence was wrong. Too consistent, too human. I turned the TV off, heart pounding, and held my breath. The exhaling continued. A low hiss, a pause, another hiss. Closer this time, like the breath wasn't coming from within the chimney, but from the mouth of the fireplace itself, as if someone were lying just out of sight on the other side of the stone, breathing toward me. The air warmed again. A sudden wave of heat rolled out of the hearth, even though it was completely unlit. I stepped back, stumbling over the rug, and didn't stop moving until my back hit the far wall. My eyes didn't leave the dark opening. I waited for something to move, something to step out, something to reach through, but nothing happened. Just the steady warmth spreading across the room and the faint sound of breathing. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning I checked the chimney from the outside. Nothing was unusual. No animals, no loose stones, no signs that anything living had gotten inside. I even looked up the hearth with the flashlight on my phone and saw nothing but pitch black stone, deeper than the light could reach. When I mentioned it to the host over the phone, they paused longer than I liked before answering. They said old stone chimneys sometimes make strange noises at night. "You're in the mountains," they added, a little too casually. They groan and breathe like anything else. But the tone in their voice told me they didn't believe that explanation any more than I did. On the third night, the breathing grew louder. Not frantic, still slow, steady, but closer, like whoever or whatever was producing it had pressed their face right up to the inside of the hearth. The air trembled with each exhale. It wasn't just warmth anymore. It felt directed, a hot line of air brushing my cheek again, as though something were leaning out toward me. I sat frozen in the old armchair across from the fireplace, my eyes locked on the dark stone. The air shimmered faintly. Then, without warning, the temperature in the room dropped, and the fire, though I hadn't lit anything, flared to life. Flames rose tall, licking the stone. I scrambled backward, the chair legs screeching across the wooden floor. Inside the fire, something moved. Not a face, not a figure, not anything I could describe. Just the suggestion of shapes, shifting like silhouettes cast by hands against a curtain. They twisted and folded into one another, bending with the flames, dissolving and then appearing again in another configuration. The longer I stared, the more they seemed to rearrange themselves into something purposeful, like a crowd shifting in the distance, like shapes swaying in a place where people shouldn't be. I blinked hard, half expecting my mind to snap the illusion apart, but the fire didn't vanish. The shapes didn't vanish. They just kept shifting in a slow rhythm, as if reacting to my attention. The heat intensified, almost suffocating. I backed into the hallway, gripping the wall. Then, just as quickly as it had flared, the fire collapsed into itself and went black. The cabin snapped back into a dead, hollow quiet. I didn't go near the fireplace again. I left the cabin lights on all night, pacing in slow circles, trying to rationalize what I had seen. Tricks of the light, exhaustion, overactive imagination. But there had been intelligence in the movement inside those flames. A rhythm, a reaction, a watching. The next morning the hearth was cold again. No ash, no charred logs, no sign of fire had ever existed. I didn't light it, didn't touch it, didn't step within 10 feet of it. But every time I walked past, the air around it felt heavier, like the warmth was still lingering somewhere just beneath the stone. On my last night, I heard the breathing again. This time it came from deeper, like something had retreated into the chimney, watching from behind the darkness. Slow, patient, almost quiet enough to ignore. But I couldn't. I lay awake, the blanket pulled to my chin, staring at the doorway to the living room where that faint exhale threaded through the silence. It never stopped, not once. When dawn finally came, I grabbed my bags and left without looking back. I drove down the mountain and didn't stop until the cabin was buried behind miles of trees. But even now, months later, I still feel it sometimes. A faint warmth brushing my cheek when a room is cold. A slow exhale in the quiet of my house when I know the vents are off. A flicker inside a candle flame that looks almost like a shape shifting just beneath the light. Watching, waiting for me to lean closer again. And I know that whatever was in that hearth never stayed in the cabin. Some warmth travels. Some breaths follow. The Airbnb sat at the very end of a narrow valley, tucked so deep into the mountains that the sky felt smaller, framed on all sides by the steep ridges and dense forest. I had driven for hours along winding roads, past fields and abandoned homesteads, until the cabin appeared like a relic at the valley's end, its weathered boards gray with age and moss creeping along the stone foundation. At first, it seemed peaceful, the kind of solitude I'd been craving after months of work and noise. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and I could hear the faint trickle of a creek somewhere down the slope. I told myself it was perfect, that I had found a pocket of the world untouched by the chaos I was trying to escape. The first night, I unpacked slowly, lighting a few lamps and making a fire in the old stone hearth. The valley was quiet at first, so quiet it felt almost unnatural, like the forest had pressed a hand over the land to still it. Then, around midnight, I heard it. Faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind brushing through the ridges. Laughter. It was distant, carried over the trees and hills, a soft, high-pitched sound that twisted and curled through the darkness. I froze in place, listening. The sound repeated. A ripple, a flicker, and then it stopped. I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the emptiness, but the valley swallowed it. I tried to dismiss it. Maybe it was travelers farther down the valley, children playing, the echoes of far-off voices bouncing between hills. But the laughter returned, closer this time, teasing the edges of the cabin as though it had moved with me. I stepped to the window, peering into the blackness of the trees, but I could see nothing. No light, no movement. Only darkness and the faint echoing sound that seemed aware of my presence. When I stopped moving, the laughter stopped. When I moved to check the porch, it began again, circling the cabin, shifting in pitch and distance in a way that made my skin crawl. The next day, I tried to leave. I had brought groceries and supplies, planning to take a quick drive into town, but the valley seemed to shift against me. Fallen trees blocked the narrow road in multiple spots, their trunks heavy and slick with rain. Where the mud had been firm, it had turned into sucking clay, pulling my tires and forcing me to turn back. The landscape that had seemed normal the day before was now treacherous, hostile, deliberate. Every attempt to move beyond the valley ended the same way, something blocking the path, something shaping the land itself. Night fell again, and with it the laughter returned, louder and closer than the first night. I stayed inside the cabin, heart pounding, unable to locate a source. It didn't matter where I went. The sound followed me. I could sit in the kitchen and it would echo through the living room. I could walk to the porch and it would drift over the ridge behind me. I thought I saw shadows moving in the trees, glimpses of forms just at the corner of my vision, but when I turned, there was nothing. Only the forest pressing in, dense and unbroken. I tried to rationalize it. The valley is known for its echoes, I told myself. Hills and ridges can carry sound in strange ways. Maybe someone was playing tricks, or the wind was catching the trees in a pattern that made them sound like voices. But rational explanations didn't match the way the laughter seemed to respond to me. It stopped when I stopped. It resumed when I moved. It was deliberate, awaiting sound, aware of me, measuring me. The second day, I attempted again to leave, taking a longer route that I thought would skirt around the fallen trees. Every turn I made seemed to bring me back to the cabin. Roads that had existed yesterday had vanished, replaced with thick undergrowth, mud, and the occasional collapsed rock slide. My GPS was useless. The signal cut out as soon as I entered the valley, leaving me to navigate by memory and the increasingly oppressive weight of the trees pressing close on either side. By mid-afternoon, I had accepted that the valley itself was holding me. Every branch, every ridge, every shadow seemed purposeful, like the land had been reshaped to keep me here. That night, the laughter was closer than ever. It was no longer a distant echo, but a presence surrounding the cabin. I could hear it behind the walls, threading through the boards, and the way it rolled across the valley made it impossible to tell how many voices there were, or if it was one voice moving. I tried to sleep, but my mind raced. I imagined children, feral people, anything that could explain it. But none of the imaginings fit the deliberate rhythm of the sound, the way it matched my movements as though reading my intentions. I stayed awake all night, huddled on the couch, every nerve straining for some detail that might explain it. The wind picked up, rattling the windows, rustling the branches above. But it wasn't the wind. It never was. I could feel the valley itself tightening around me, inhaling with each shift of the laughter, exhaling when I stopped moving. It was alive in a way that made me shiver to consider, patient and deliberate, shaping everything around me to ensure I could not leave. The following morning, I tried once more to navigate out, walking instead of driving, hoping that on foot I might find some path that had eluded me. But the forest closed in, trees bending unnaturally, fallen logs where paths should have been, mudslides blocking the narrow creek crossings. Every turn led back to the cabin, as if the valley were folding over itself, recreating the roads behind me only to erase them the moment I left. I began to panic. My sense of time slipped. Every hour felt like a trap, every shadow a warning. By the third night, I had stopped trying to leave during daylight. I barricaded the cabin as best I could, moving furniture against the doors, double locking what locks still worked. Yet the laughter did not cease. If anything, it became more distinct, more taunting. I could make out the shape of words in the cadence, The rising and falling pitch, the sharp edges like someone's breath caught in excitement. I could no longer tell if I was imagining it or if the valley had decided that I was to remain its prisoner until it chose otherwise. Sleep was impossible. I stayed awake, listening to the echoing voices, watching the shadows dance between the trees outside. Every crack of a branch, every flutter of leaves made my heart jump. I began to feel the presence of something just beyond the clearing, moving with me, following me, circling the cabin. I could not see it directly, but its awareness was undeniable, a force that matched the rhythm of the laughter and the impossibility of escape. By the fourth night, I realized the valley had become more than a place. It had become an entity. Its hills and trees were alive in ways I could not explain. Every path, every road, every chance of escape had been nullified. I was not merely trapped. I was observed, measured, and, in some way, held. I spent the night standing at the edge of the porch, staring into the dark forest, counting breaths, counting heartbeats, counting the moments between the laughter and the silence. I could feel the valley shifting subtly, a pressure in the air, like it was aware of my fear and relishing it. The next morning, I packed in a rush, abandoning the idea of driving anywhere. I left the cabin with my heart in my throat, sprinting along the path that had briefly opened itself, praying the valley had finally granted me passage. When I reached the main road, the forest behind me exhaled, a subtle shift in the wind, a movement of branches and leaves that felt like the valley letting go. I did not look back. Even after leaving, I could feel its presence lingering. On the drive down the winding mountain roads, I thought I heard faint laughter echoing through the trees in the distance, too far to locate but too distinct to ignore. The valley had marked me. I could feel it in the subtle pressure of wind against my ears, in the way shadows seemed to cling to the periphery of my vision. The experience left me uneasy, the memory of being trapped, observed, and measured by something larger than myself settled deep in my chest. I have avoided valleys since, even small hollows in the mountains. I tell people it was just isolation, overactive imagination, the echoes of hills playing tricks on me. But I know the truth. The Airbnb was never the problem. The valley was. It is patient, deliberate, and aware. And I cannot shake the memory of the laughter, how it moved with me, how it stopped when I stopped, how it began again when I tried to flee. Even now, months later, I feel it exhale in the quiet spaces of my life, reminding me of the night a valley refused to release me.